Advance warning. I haven't been through this for quite a long time. I looked it up. It was actually 2018 that I went to Agile 2018 and did a talk on cost of delay. So it's been a while. We've had a pandemic since, and we all survived, which is awesome. Well done for surviving. It's also a hard topic to talk about because there is generally a very wide variation of people's understanding of this topic. So let me just kind of get a little bit of a read of the room if I could. So how many of you here have read any of Don Reinertsen's books? Okay, like half a dozen maybe. How many of you have heard of cost of delay as a concept? A few more, okay, well, quite a few. How many of you is your understanding of cost of delay comes from SAFE? Not very many. That's good. Okay, cool. All right, that helps. that gives me a bit of a read. Okay, so to get us started, we're going to play a little game just for a second. So what I want you to imagine is that you're about to get stranded on a desert island for 5 years, 1,824 days, and you're allowed to take one item with you. And I want you to think about what that one item would be. It's a long time, 5 years, on your own, in a desert island, you're stuck there, you're allowed to take one item with you. So, sorry, what? A matchbox? Like a matchbox car, or? Oh yeah, okay. So a box of matches, yeah, okay. Anyone else? A helicopter? A helicopter with a lot of fuel, or? Any others? A what? An axe. Oh yeah, okay, that's a goodie. Yeah. A tent fly, okay. Nobody's mentioned their partner yet, which is like, you might need to have a conversation when you get home about that, but okay, just keep in mind that item that you were thinking about that you're going to have for the next 5 years, just to you, not your partner. And unfortunately, that item got lost. You chose the wrong airline, and they lost that on the way. So you don't have that item that you were thinking about. Okay, so what is that item? And now what I want you to think about is, what would you be willing to pay to have that item for the next 5 years? You're going to be stuck on this desert island for 5 years. What is that thing worth to you? What's your helicopter worth? Your helicopter full of fuel, hopefully. 12.7 million dollars US. The axe, what's the axe worth to you? No? A lot more, yes, a lot more you buy from Bunnings, which is an important point. Okay, so basically what we're doing here is, this is economics, basic economics. You're trying to estimate the value of something based on your willingness to pay for that thing, yeah? And it's hard. It's not like it doesn't come naturally to you necessarily. I think when you wander around the supermarket or Bunnings, maybe it does come naturally to you, and you look at the thing and you think, oh yeah, that's worth that much and I'll buy that. Willingness to pay is basically tested for every item that you put on the trolley. So that's one way of sort of estimating value of things. One thing that I find interesting about this topic is that economics, people think that's about money, and it's actually not. It's really about the scarcity and your need to make some choices in that context of scarcity. So I only let you choose one item, for instance, and you had to choose one thing, and therefore you're trying to figure out what that one thing might be. So if you've got infinite money, then obviously, you know, it doesn't really matter what you put in your shopping trolley. In fact, you're probably not doing shopping, you're having someone else do the shopping for you, and they can put whatever they like into it. So it's actually the scarcity that forces us to choose, and therefore it's the choices that we make in the presence of scarcity that basically tells us how much we value those things. We just happen to use money, dollars, as a way of kind of like comparing, because we, that's a commodity item that we can basically switch from one to another. So let's bring that back to our world. How many of you here work in some form of product development, software or other? Pretty much everyone. Okay, that's good. You've got the right audience. This is not Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, so yeah, so the thing with supply side and product development is, if only it was like this, that it was just like you turn on the tap and the magic just flows out. Like, that's kind of what people sometimes think it's like, but it's actually not much like that at all. So supply and product development tends to look a little bit more like this. It's super easy to turn it off. Like, if anyone has ever been through a redundancy process, like, it's a little bit painful, but it's actually easy to turn it off. Growing it again is really painful. Like, it takes months and months before you sort of get to any sort of capacity that you had before. So part of the reason for that is there's a whole series of learning curves that are going on. They all sort of overlap with one another. There's, you're learning how to work with other people. You're learning the context that you're in. You're learning about the level of technical debt that you're dealing with, the code base itself. Maybe there's a new language in there for you. There's a whole series of learning curves that are going on, and those all take time. So when you hire someone new, even if they know the tech stack, they're still learning how to work with other people. They're probably learning your particular problem space, and that takes time. So it can take months before you get up to the capacity they had before. So this is a problem. How many are familiar with cumulative flow diagrams, CFDs? Yeah, a few people. I love them. They're awesome. I hate the ones in Jira, though. The ones in Jira really piss me off. The ones in Azure DevOps are much better, but the ones in Jira really annoy me. A lot of projects sort of end up looking like this. Like, the beginning of the project is relatively flat, and then people sort of work out how they're going to work with one another. They get a head of steam up, and then towards the end of the project, they're just sort of tidying up bits and pieces, and it sort of flattens off. So pretty typical sort of example of this. But basically, it takes time to grow that capacity. And then if you look at the other side, because we're talking some economics here, the demand side feels a little bit like, well, this to start with, everybody wants a piece of you, which is kind of like, if you've chosen product management, this is kind of your world. But worse, they don't agree with one another. Like, you've got 10 different stakeholders, and 2 of them will disagree with one another. So you're basically trying to figure out, who's going to win this tug of war. It's insatiable, and of course everybody thinks that their particular thing is number one. So how do you sort of deal with that? It's a bit of a challenge. So maybe that's just my experience. Anybody else? Yeah, pretty familiar? Yeah, okay. Limited capacity, everything's number one, competing stakeholders. Yeah, it's tough. So maybe an alternative title for this would be, how to survive in a world where stakeholders want it all. And even worse than that, they would like it all yesterday. Thank you very much. So they've got a really high sense of urgency about it. So let me flip it back to you guys for a minute, just to get a bit of a read as well. Like, how do your teams prioritize? What's out there? Use a scoring matrix. One that you've spun yourself, or?
Rice scoring.
Rice plus plus. Okay. How many people here have heard of rice? Okay. Seems to be really popular in New Zealand. I wonder why. I blame Anthony. Okay. So a bit of rice. Anyone using anything else? Like?
Just
oh.
We haven't done anything yet. But
all right. Okay.
Already introduced it.
All right. Let's talk later. I'm interested in that. Any other weird and wonderful versions? Rice. Anyone doing weighted shortest job first? Anyone using safe? Safe. What about a classic Scrum? What was that? HiPPO, oh yeah. HiPPO's highest paid person's opinion, whatever the boss's boss decides, that's the thing we'll do. Yeah, there's not much, I mean, value over effort is kind of like the typical Scrum version, if you come across loads of them. Anyone been here? Anyone been here? Oh, there's a few people. Anyone used Moscow as a prioritization method? A few, yeah. Yeah, did it end up in this? Like, there was a lot of must-haves. You basically had an encounter with the KGB. It's like all of a sudden all these things are committed, and yeah, Moscow kind of sucks as a method, not as a place, but as a method, it sucks. Someone mentioned HiPPO, where you basically get squashed by someone who's paid a lot more, somewhere up the food chain. Equities are, I mean, it's not usually talked about so much, but a version where you are sort of dividing up capacity and maybe you're empowering a set of product managers to choose for that particular squad what goes on. That's sort of a form of equity. You're sort of sharing out, like, as a product person, my main stakeholders are, you know, chief marketing officer or the you know, the head of operations or whatever it happens to be. So my team, we mostly deliver to this particular person. So there might be another version of that. Where this tends to fall down is that most larger organizations have a lot of dependencies that come back to one or two teams. So this basically doesn't work. Nice idea, but it doesn't quite work. It's also very blind to value. It's basically whatever that one or two stakeholders end up saying, that's what you end up doing. So it's not particularly focused on the value side of the equation. A favorite of mine, I don't know if anyone here is into Eurovision. We're not in Europe, or Australia for that matter. Australia's in Eurovision, like, what the heck? But Eurovision, the Eurovision model, as I like to call it, is kind of like this horse trading, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. All of the friends sort of vote for each other, so they vote in blocks, you know. It's highly political. It's not really got anything to do with the quality of the music. It's mostly kind of like, you know, a friends voting for friends sort of thing. This actually happens in bigger organizations quite a lot. Like, you got to know the person to get the thing done. There's a lot of shoulder tapping of specific developers, you know, like, oh, could you do this little thing for me? That happens a bit. Eurovision, I find it funny, not so funny in big organizations. Anybody attempted to do some form of sort of benefit cost ratio, high jump thing, where you kind of like anything over benefit cost ratio of 10 gets funded and approved, and everything below that doesn't? Well, a little bit like Jessica Ennis here, like, it looks amazing when she pulls it off, but like what you don't see is the 4 or 5 attempts and the 10 years of training that it took to get over that bar in such a graceful manner. The BCR kind of approach tends to be more of a high jump, like just go and get a bit more information, go and find some more benefits, go and figure out a way of squeezing some of the costs out in some way, shape or form. So this tends to be more iterative in nature, which could be a good thing, but it tends to involve a lot of work up front before you actually get started with anything. And they tend to attract, I mean, when you're looking at benefit cost ratio as a way of prioritizing, that tends to explode the scope of the things that you work on, because I'll add this feature and this feature and this feature and this feature, and now I've reached the BCR high jump sort of thing. So it tends to lead to big batches. Or you could use something like cost of delay. So something that'll help you focus on value and urgency, which I'll talk about in a minute. Better trade-off decisions, and we'll talk about that, and changing the focus of the conversation. So this, for me, is kind of the magic of it. Yeah, let's dig into it a little bit. None of this is me, by the way. It's all this guy, John, who I mentioned earlier. His books can be hard going, but they're super valuable. The Blue Book in particular is kind of like just chapter by chapter, bite-sized chunks. You can actually get quite a lot out of it. But in his words, you know, if you only quantify one thing, you should be quantifying the cost of delay, which is interesting because most organizations try to quantify a lot of other things in the system, but almost never the cost of delay. So what is this thing? It's basically us trying to combine value and urgency. these two things which humans typically are not very good at differentiating between the two, actually. So trying to figure out how we can do both of them. Another way of thinking about it is, what is the impact of time on the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve from this? So the benefits that you're looking for, how is that going to leak away over time? Or, you know, if we had it earlier, what would that be worth? So I have a series of, well, here's a nice way of sort of illustrating it. Let me explain this one. It's a little bit confusing. So this is a value stream map, if you've ever done one, which kind of looks at the timeline of a particular feature. This is a single feature going through the system from when it was first captured. So that moment where someone was like, this is the thing that needs to be done, I'm going to run some system, probably Jira, but hopefully not Jira. It then spent 18 weeks waiting for someone to kind of look at it, and they decided to do a proof of concept, which took them 24 hours, a little bit of risk reduction, a second guess of that proof of concept afterwards, which is that little yellow dot, another 11 weeks of waiting before it actually made it to the top of the backlog and went through dev test, which took about 82 hours. This is before, no, this actually comes from like a year after the continuous delivery book, which is right over there, was written. So DevOps kind of didn't really exist. I mean, it did exist, but in like pockets, and it didn't have a name. So they took 9 weeks to go from dev done to in production, which these days is horrific, but kind of normal in big companies, especially back then. So overall, it took 38 weeks of waiting. Now, this particular thing, we worked it out, had a cost of delay of $210,000 per week. So that's $8 million US that they've just door, basically, with all of this waiting time. That's just looking at the waiting time in here. Right? Lost revenue, yes. Yeah. We were talking about detention and demurrage earlier. This was a wrong calculation of the detention and demurrage fees that you get charged when you book a container with Maersk. So you book a container, if you hold on to it for too long at the beginning, before you fill it up and someone comes and takes it away, or at the end, you don't give it back in time, then you get charged detention and demurrage fees. This was a wrong calculation. They just simply weren't charging their huge number of customers, Maersk is a big company, to the tune of $210,000 per week. But when you hear that number and then you look at all the red dots there, you're like, oh, okay. That was kind of dumb, wasn't it? What's also interesting about this is that, again, if you're a fan of Don Reinertsen, you might have heard the fuzzy front end term. So that's all of the things that happen before the team actually start working on it. There's a lot of focus on the efficiency and the flow of what happens here. Like, why aren't those people working faster? Yeah, why is that so slow going through this bit here? You know, but nobody seems to pay a lot of attention to all of the queues that are before that or after that. In fact, thankfully, the queues after it. Thank Lord Jez Humble and Dave Farley for basically showing us the way. The back end of that is generally better these days, but happy hunting grounds, if you're a product manager, which I think a lot of you are, is in the front end of this process, where there's tons of waiting time and not a lot of economics going on. Don also talks about the urgency paradox. So before the point where the team are kind of like, could you do this piece of work? It's not urgent. But then all of a sudden it's really urgent. But of course, the company was losing that amount of money per week, every week, before it got to the team. So it's kind of strange, don't you think? Like, so I mean, throughout this whole thing, you kind of get this sense of, for me, cost of delay is more about a way of seeing our world, our complex product development world. It's just a way of sort of looking at it and understanding it in a different way. Which, if you don't have that set of lens on, you just won't see it necessarily.
Is there also something called differential cost of delay? I mean, during that time, they must have doing something or delivering some value, right? So there is cost of delay, there will be differential cost of delay.
Yes, yes. good point. There a differential cost of delay? Yes, there is. The problem is that we're not even doing it for one feature, so your ability to figure it out which of them are more valuable or not is pretty limited. But yeah, you could make some assumptions that, I mean, it's not that the team was sitting around twiddling their thumbs. There was clearly a lot of other stuff going on. They were super busy, thus the queues. But if you had an economic lens, if you had an understanding of the cost of delay, it's a cool question to ask. Hey, this thing you've asked for, you think you're charging the detention and demurrage fees incorrectly. By how much? And then someone went and did like 5 minutes worth of work to figure it out and then came back with, oh, this is actually worth about $210,000 US dollars per week. And I'll get onto it a little bit, but there's actually a power law distribution in your backlogs, which is part of why you shouldn't lump it all together into a big scope, because you're really hunting for these little black swans that will give you the outsized sort of impact. So yeah, impact of time and outcomes. So one little game that I play with folks in this world is kind of like, if you're struggling with putting a number on these things, I say, in my bag over here, I have a magic wand and I can magic up your thing just like that, and it exists. And then I ask them some follow-up questions. So what would that be worth you if you had it right now? Part of the reason why this is a really good thing to ask is that people they're asking for it when they think it can be done, as opposed to what would it be worth if you had it right now? That's a different question, and they often don't ask that. It's a little bit obscured, but the question is really, you know, I don't need to know exact. I just need orders of magnitude. Like, is this worth $1,000 a week, or is it $1 million a week, or somewhere in between? Like, if you just give me orders of magnitude, then I can do something with that. So the idea that you need precise numbers here, you don't need it. So if there is a date in mind, ask them, you know, what would it be worth if you had that a month earlier? And that kind of gets them into a different mode of thinking about, well, what would that be worth for that month? Because I haven't actually thought about that. And in many cases, they haven't thought about that. And of course, you know, what would it be worth? Well, you know, what would we lose if we got it a month later? Part of the reason for driving into these, and this sort of comes back to the changing of the conversation, is that a lot of deadlines that you'll find in organizations are complete fabrications. I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but the cost of delay of having it before or after that date is exactly the same. There isn't there are some cases where it is genuinely there's a specific date where something needs to be done by, or, you know, some regulation kicks in, or there are 15 other things that need to come together at that same point, and if this thing is late, then that delays all of those. There are examples of that, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them, the deadline is just a number, you know, a date plucked out of someone's ear. And if you ask the question, you get an answer around, oh yeah, it would be worth this much more. If it was late by a month, it'd be this much. And sometimes that number isn't actually that big. So that kind of makes you wonder why it's a deadline when nobody's going to die and you're not even going to lose that much money. So we're trying to put a price tag on time. Here is a model which seemed obvious to me, but apparently it's not to others. So I've used this in a bunch of different places. If you can break the model, I'd love to hear about it. But in effect, pretty much everything we're doing in our organizations will contribute to one or more of these buckets of value. What I would definitely advise against, even in whatever prioritization system you're doing today, is that there's a lot of categorization that goes on when actually there's a lot of and that you should really be considering. So there's a lot of things which, you know, we are going to reduce costs from this and we're going to increase revenue. I mean, there's boatloads of those, really. You don't have to look too far in organizations. Or this is actually about us, it's more about us protecting the customers we've already got. So we're going to protect the revenue we've already got. It's not necessarily about new customers. And actually protecting the customers we've got from competitors board with our product is actually sometimes way more valuable than any marginal increase in revenue that you might generate from it. But as product folks, like I would definitely say there's not enough people who are close enough to revenue numbers and or cost numbers necessarily. I mean, cost of the business, not the cost of doing the work. Way too many people focus on that. I'm talking about actually the cost of a process or whatever it happens to be, or the revenue associated with some improvement. A lot of what we do is kind of automating shit, and you should be able to figure out the value of automating that stuff or making it faster, that sort of thing. So this seems to be useful. It's turned up in a bunch of other places, which has surprised me. But anyway, so if you want to try to have conversations about where the value might be, maybe consider these, and yeah, make sure that you're considering more than one of these buckets. And then you sort of go through this process, the classic sort of 5 ways. Just keep on asking why until you get to one or more of these. If you need to make assumptions along the way, fine, just write it down. Like, here's the assumption we made: an average customer is worth this much. You know, the lifetime value of a customer we think is worth this much. The average FTE cost is worth this much. Just write it down. So if you don't know the number, go and make friends with your colleagues in finance, and they'll probably give you a thumbs up for some of these to be able to then generate some actual figures. Yeah, and just sort of don't be surprised if it's more than one bucket. Would be one thing I'd say. So you're making the value equal to the cost of the alternatives would be one of those. Like, so for, you know, if you're automating some process, it's going to be faster, so there's less waiting for some customers, so that's going to help you protect revenue. You've got the current manual cost, which you should be able to get a guesstimate of what that looks like. You're going to avoid some human errors, so you're going to avoid some costs that are related to that sort of thing, as an example. Or here's another one, you know, improving invoice. I mean, I saw a bunch of these on SAP World, you know, improving invoice clarity and accuracy, the amount of time spent by an organization actually just explaining, you know, the customer's invoice. When you get big enough, becomes a really big thing. Also, sort of reducing their payment delays. If it's clear what they're paying for, they'll pay faster. That reduces your need for working capital, all those sorts of things. So yeah, there are dozens of examples of these sorts of things that you can sort of go through. I will do some a bit more in a minute. The urgency side of it, don't be scared. There's a little bit of calculus. Pay attention to what's on the y-axis here. So we are talking benefits per week, and obviously time on the x-axis. So this is what it looks like for the vast majority of the things that you find in software, you know, product world. Most of them look like this, especially in bigger companies. There's some sort of ramp up to a peak, and then that peak goes on in perpetuity, you know, forever. You've automated some process, for instance. Yeah, it's sustained for a long period of time. So what happens if we're late? Well, the same ramp up happens. You hit the same peak, but you're late by a few weeks, you know? And then you're just saying, okay, well, this is the delay cost. This is a simple parallelogram. You don't have to actually do that much calculation. It's actually pretty simple in order to figure out the delay cost. So this is one profile which I've seen lots and lots of, long benefits timeline, and the peak is unaffected by the delay. It doesn't matter if you're a week late or a month late or whatever, you're still going to have the same peak, but you will still be late and you'll lose that amount of value that's associated with it. This is less common, but you still see some of it, which is, you know, if you're late, it really does start to, the peak actually starts to reduce. You can actually approximate this one still pretty well, even with a parallelogram. It's still not that far off, and again, you don't need to be super precise. These ones are harder. This is probably Sin 7 world for the Sin 7 folks, because you're in kind of like a world where you're in a competitive environment, and if you get there first, that means some other competitor doesn't get there, and you maintain that difference for a long period of time. So this tends to be a lot more startup land is like this, actually. You know, if you're starting a new Uber now, like, it's like, that's hard work. You know, so a lot of it is, this is extremely sensitive. You tend to see very, very high cost of delay in startup land, which is why a lot of the prioritization systems that come from startup land are a bit weird, frankly. They're not normal. They don't really apply to a whole bunch of other organizations. Like, yeah, and yet, because we love startups, we tend to adopt the startup mentality around it. There are examples where there's some sort of option expiry date, as in, some sort of regulatory change, for instance, or something that's seasonal. So anything that has a genuine date, like if you're coming to market with some nice new Christmas decorations and you're late by a month, shit, that's unfortunate. So actually the seasonal one actually looks more like this, where the delay cost is more, there's a big hump. It tends to be very tight. Like fireworks season, for instance, it's basically 4 days. And then you got to wait a whole year before it repeats itself. But those do have these dates. So that option expiry date can apply to any of these different shapes, but it's important to sort of understand those shapes. One thing not to forget is that the business that we're in is actually mostly about information. A lot of what we're doing is a journey of discovery, and there is value in knowing in advance whether path A or path B leads to success. Like if you knew in advance that path A led to a cliff and then you're going to have to double back and then take path B, I would pay money for that, So, I mean, this is very common in pharmaceuticals, oil companies, those sorts of things, where they will actually go and buy someone who has that information. They've done some of the early discovery in order to then set off on a better path. So information is value. In our world, information has some value associated with it. So don't think that this is, there's no customers associated with it, therefore there's no value. No, that's not true in our world, I'm afraid. So some ways of quantifying value of information: what would it be worth for us to avoid taking that wrong path? What would it cost us to obtain that information firsthand? And if it was available on the open market, what would we be willing to pay to to get that correct path? So those are things. This comes up sometimes. Yeah, don't be surprised if you see it. Some examples. I mentioned improving invoice accuracy. Again, the math here is not that hard. Like my 11-year-old can do this with her eyes closed almost. Like, okay, I'm going to reduce the number of customers paying late. That's worth an additional 4 million per annum to us. This came from finance. And there's going to be a reduction in the number of calls to our call center. That's about 5 FTEs. That's about 20K per FTE. I'm not going to say where the FTEs were. Weirdly, and you'll see this a lot, is that the value that people think often turns out not to be it. So people are really focused on reducing the cost of servicing those calls, but actually there's way more value in just getting paid earlier. So you take those numbers, divide it by 52, and you've got your cost of delay per week. Not that hard, right? Say again? Yeah, there's a lot of people get their emotions. Well, yeah. For everyone who's asking for something, their thing is number one. That's our world. Another example. So this one has a date. So new regulation is going to be effective from, you can now see how old this is, September 2015. They were like, okay, we could actually handle that regulation manually, therefore it's going to be this much. So this is the cost of delay of that thing. Often there is a manual workaround, but people won't tell you there were manual workaround. You got to ask the question. It's like a subtle way of figuring out, actually there is an alternative here, and like, this should not be our focus, just do the manual thing. Like the best software is the software you don't write by a million times. If you can't, it's effective immediately and we're not compliant, we think there's a risk of us getting fined now. You can start to apply some probability to these things, that's fine. Sort of just write down your assumptions, basically. So in this case, it was actually quite a bit higher. Okay, and then we get to the actual prioritization part, which is actually scheduling in product development world, but anyway. So if I give you these 3 requirements and they've got these 3 different costs of delays, which one would you do first? This is not a trick question. It's pretty bloody obvious, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's great if they all happen to take roughly the same amount of time to do, which is almost never true. So when the time required, when, you know, how much time they're going to block the pipeline for, you do need to take that into account. I know there's kind of like, I've had massive arguments with the no estimates people on this, and actually estimates are kind of useful. So when the time to deliver varies, then you need to divide by some sense of how big it is. Again, don't need to know the exact thing. Order of magnitude is fine enough. T-shirt size is fine, as long as they're consistent, you know. But that's where we get to an actual prioritization method, which is not cost of delay on its own. That's cost of delay divided by duration, but that's a bit of a mouthful. So we called it CD3, and that's kind of good because it differentiates from SAFE's weighted shortest job first. So that's what that looks like. So we're combining value and urgency into cost of delay, and we're dividing it by the duration, how long it's going to block the pipeline for. Doesn't need to be super accurate. Don't use those estimates to beat people with, please. A bit of math. This is what first in, first out scheduling looks like. These 3 projects, if you just happen to take them in that order, because that's the order they came in at, that would be pretty dumb. That's the delay cost incurred. But if you use CD3, you basically get a massive reduction in the delay cost incurred. So it works. You just need to have the numbers for it. There's the maths, if you're really interested. Important to say, people make decisions, not an algorithm, so don't just blindly follow the GPS and have it lead you off a cliff. Like, ultimately, sometimes it will give you some things you're like, that doesn't smell right. And it's okay to go, actually, that doesn't really line up with our, you know, we've got this cost of delay thing to start a pizza shop over the road. Yeah, but that's not our strategy. So why are we doing that thing? Like, it's okay to adjust your priorities based on having some strategy. I would recommend starting with CD3 as an initial triage and then adjust your cost of delay to reflect that strategy, because then if you've got HiPPOs who are putting their foot on the scale to kind of weight the things that they want, at least you'll know how much they're weighting the scale by, and you can sort of play that back to them at some point. And again, write down those reasons. I get this question a bit, why divide by duration, not cost? It's mostly because in product development world, the thing that is scarce is not money. Weirdly, like, if you don't have money, but you've got a really good idea, you'll find a VC will probably throw money at you, or if you can make a good enough case for it, someone will expand a budget and you'll get money for it. So money isn't actually the scarce thing. You can kind of big brother and steal it. Capacity, you could think of it like that, like number of hours, for instance. Difficult to scale, maybe, you know, one team plus another team equals more, perhaps. Mythical man month, but yes, maybe. Bit of flexibility in that area, but time, you can't play with that. It's kind of ticking by for everyone. The hour you spend with me, you're never going to get back. It's gone. So this is why we ask, how long will the pipeline be blocked? The pipeline being the team's capacity. How long is this going to block this team for? Is that a week? Is it 2 weeks? Is it whatever? Try not to do it at the individual level. That's really dumb. It usually takes a team for these things. So yes, estimates are useful. Just don't abuse them. Yeah. So prioritization. I've sort of covered that, I think. I want to talk a little bit about the trade-off decisions. So one problem we have in a lot of tech spaces, less so in startup land and kind of, you know, software-oriented companies, but in a lot of others, is that your capacity is treated like a cost center, and so it's just, you know, constantly being squeezed as something that's just costing money, which is a bit painful. So, for instance, I got a choice to make. Do I go with supplier A? It's going to cost me 100 grand. It'll take them 10 weeks to do it. Or supplier B, it's going to cost me 50 grand, but it's going to take them 20 weeks to do it. Oh, I mean, the accountants are like, oh, half price. What a deal. That sounds awesome. What information do we have? This is a must-have feature. Using Moscow, this is a must-have feature. Okay, that doesn't help me make this decision at all, right? What about the return on investment is 300%? Again, that piece of information doesn't really help me make that decision whether to go with supplier A or supplier B. Benefit cost ratio of 4.6. Okay, now maybe that will adjust, that will change the benefit cost ratio if I go with a cheaper supplier. And so it might give you probably lean towards supplier B in that case. What if you're using SAFE? SAFE's weighted shortest job first. You've got relative business value, relative time criticality, and relative risk reduction. I'm not really feeling something that's going to help me make this decision. Like, do I go with supplier A or supplier B? Right. Put this in here just for today. Again, more relative, percentage gut feel, relative, still can't make this decision. I don't know what to do here. Maybe you're using the Kanban different modes, expedite, standard, yada, yada, yada. Expedite. Okay, maybe I'm getting a sense of urgency that maybe this is urgent. And so therefore, maybe I'm going to lean more towards the shorter time frame of 10 weeks. But I still can't really make that decision about whether it's worth spending twice as much for the same thing. Or I could have some information which helps me make this decision. Like, okay, this thing's costing me 10 grand a week for every week that we don't have it. I've got a choice between supplier A or supplier B, and I'm going to get it 10 weeks earlier with supplier A. All of a sudden, it's damn easy to make a call, right? Pretty simple. Yeah, similar. Do I use offshore resource, local resource, different time frames, those sorts of things? The idea is you need some information to make these decisions better. Infrastructure supplier, so on and so forth. The point there is that we make trade-off decisions 100 times a day in product development, and we're making those decisions without the information we need to really make some better decisions within it, you know? And then lastly, changing the focus. I've sort of talked about this a little bit already, but you know, this experience started at Maersk Line for me, so pretty big container shipping company. Implementing it there really wasn't as hard as we thought. Like, everyone was like, oh, this is going to be really hard. Actually wasn't. It definitely had an effect of going viral. Once one team started talking in terms of cost of delay, other teams were like, it's really hard to compete with that. So all of a sudden, lots of other teams started also using cost of delay to explain the, you know, the urgency and the value of the things that they were. This is a bunch of people sort of sitting around here, and interestingly, one of these people was the HiPPO. I won't say who, but what was really interesting about this as a way of sort of controlling that sort of HiPPO factor is that when you are digging into the actual numbers, you tend to have more fruitful conversations about where the value of it is, rather than just Bob in the corner or Sue over there says that this is the most urgent thing or the most valuable thing. You actually start talking about the actual, you know, what's actually driving that, and collectively you'll make a better decision. Yeah, little examples here where, you know, the product owners were super impatient about applying this, which was pretty cool. This one's actually pretty hard to do, but trying to get organizations to actually have a crack at the value of the thing before they ask for the cost of it, which seems kind of weird, but everyone, they're happy to ask for cost day in, day out, and the amount of time spent by teams estimating stuff that just never gets done or never will get done is kind of staggering. Whereas if you actually get some sense of the value beforehand, you can actually sift through those in a better way, and therefore use less time mucking around doing estimating and sizing and specifying things that actually are not that valuable. Yeah, even enterprise architecture got in on that. Like, shock horror. They were kind of like, they're going to start using, you know, cost of delay for them to kind of prioritize their backlogs. And this was kind of the kicker for me. It was like when senior management at Merce started talking to each other about cost of delay of the things that they were working on and why this thing was blocked, that became like really powerful. Yeah, so it's all part of kind of, I think, you know, resetting the conversation around how these things work, because we tend to talk a lot about cost and schedule and scope of these things, and there isn't anywhere near enough conversation about the value, the speed, and, you know, the feedback of whether that thing's actually working or not. Like, what are we actually using to drive our scope? It should really be feedback about whether it works or not. So I think this is a super important part of changing the conversation. This is the kind of change that I'd like to see in a lot more organizations, and including here in New Zealand. There's still a lot of people who are doing things more on the left and less on the right. But I feel like cost of delay is a big part of changing all of those to some extent. Weirdly, you focus on costs, they tend to go up. I mean, that example from way back with the value stream map with the proof of concept, where they spent, you know, a day doing a proof of concept. Do you know why they did a proof of concept? Anyone want a hazard? Why did they do a proof of concept on that thing?
Confirm the cost or to validate the cost.
Yeah, not to confirm that it worked, because that's what you should be using proof of concepts for. No, it was like, this was an organization that had a KPI around estimates. And so therefore everyone was afraid of putting an estimate in there without actually having a proof of concept. So they wasted time putting together a proof of concept in order to narrow down, you know, their range, how far they would be off their estimate, which is kind of sad when you think about it. But, you know, I think that's an example of, if you focus on costs, the costs will go up. So that actually added time. It took time off the coal face for people actually delivering value to go and do a proof of concept, which was not about understanding whether that was the right thing to do. It was mostly about, do we think we can do this in this amount of time? Which I think is a bit sad. Yeah, and yeah, we shouldn't really be surprised by this, but I guess, yeah, in the absence of value, of information about value and urgency, the whole organization, the whole system will optimize for other things. And it tends to optimize for things like, you know, estimate accuracy and other, you know, throughput or story points or whatever it happens to be. So if you can kind of inject some different information into that environment, you can find that it'll take the focus away from some of those less value-adding conversations and more onto the things that are actually worthwhile doing. I mentioned this earlier because you asked about differential cost of delay, which sounds like a math problem. But what's super interesting when you do this over a whole portfolio is that you will generally find, at least for every time I've seen it, it looks like this. You get this very non-linear distribution of value in your systems and your backlogs, in effect. So, you know, the top quarter of requirements, as they were termed there, they had an average of 230,000 a week compared to these other ones, which were tiny in comparison. So yes, those other things, it's not that they have zero value necessarily, but there's definitely an uneven distribution. And when you plot them out, it's even more stark. It's basically a power law curve that it turns out that there is a small number of features for which the value is and the cost of delay is very high, and a long tail of stuff, which is still probably good stuff to do, but it's just not that. It's not the same. So these are kind of like the black swans that we're looking for. We're looking for the rare and extreme, and yeah, they're out there. They'll be in your backlogs. It's worthwhile kind of looking at it. And I've seen this a number of times to the point where I expect it now, basically. So lots and lots of different team backlogs. It's pretty normal. The other thing we're saying is that the arrival of these is random. They're not like, they don't line up to annual planning. They don't line up to your project scoping exercise. You know, you will be halfway through the project and some bright person in the team will come up with an idea that's like worth way more. A good example of this, which I've talked about a few times, is comes from hotels.com. If anybody's used hotels.com, but hotel booking site, and one of the most valuable things that they did was actually they changed the terms and conditions right before you click the confirm and make the payment. So they basically saw in their funnel metrics, they saw a bit of a drop off, or a big drop off at the point where people were sort of hovering and they weren't quite going to confirm it. And so they changed some wording to the terms and conditions that basically said, you know, if you change your mind, there's no fee for basically cancelling. And that small change, which was like tiny little A/B test that they ran, it was a bit of CSS. It was really nothing. It was like worth $50 million US per annum to them. So like huge things like that, which tiny little changes can come from anywhere. Listen to your people. The people who are closest to the problems tend to have the best ideas about how to improve it if they're existing in that sort of space. So I probably got those numbers wrong. I think it was 50 million a month or 50 million a week or something crazy like that. I'd have to go and look it up. A few other things about cost of delay quantified. So categorization and relative isn't really enough. It doesn't change the conversation. Focusing just on the urgency profile doesn't give you the magnitude, which is kind of not enough. And yeah, like I've been saying, there's thousands of trade-off decisions that our teams are making day in, day out, that this bit of information can help them make better decisions. And they're smart enough to figure it out. They understand it. So yeah, that's me basically. Improve prioritization, better trade-off decisions, change the conversation. So I think questions?
All right, thanks very much, Josh. And I guess just to give everyone an idea of how simple this is, literally having this discussion this afternoon, talking about a release, big product release that's going on the weekend. Never try to organize a meetup in the same week as doing a product release, by the way. It's a dumb idea. Something that has a 7-figure revenue value to us. Okay, so then we divide that by number of business days in the month, and that gives us about a 5-figure number per day. The team was starting to talk about, well, what if we just delayed the release by a couple of days because of these issues? So I turned around and quoted that 5-figure value. Hey everyone, did you know this is what that decision would cost us per day? The head snapping in the room in my direction was amazing.
Yeah.
Like even people who were like, you know, I knew that they were like multitasking on their laptops and suddenly attention. Yeah, it is a really, really, really powerful thing because people don't necessarily think like that.
No.
I mean, the biggest head snap was actually from one of our sales guys who I actually thought he kind of had the stuff in his brain, and it turned out he didn't. So yeah, don't underestimate the value of looking at it like this. Right, so with that, we'll take questions. I think we'll do a repeat the questions rather than trying to run the mic around the room. So down the back.
Why we found angry before? What's
No.
one of the most challenging things when you say cost of delay? You mentioned about
Yeah.
So the question was around just what have we found as being challenging in terms of cost of delay, in terms of applying cost of delay?
I think it's actually mostly just getting started. Like, it feels like it's this Everest that, you know, I'm going to save up a ton of energy for that sort of thing. But you can actually start relatively small. Like, take some initiative that's already in flight. You don't have to do it everywhere. Like, just choose some small area. Like, you can take it as a little experiment that you run and kind of just reduce the size of that Everest. So I'd say the hardest thing is usually just getting started. There are definitely some organizations, like if you're in the public sector, for instance, it can be a little bit more difficult to get to a dollar figure. But it doesn't have to be a dollar figure. I think that's the other thing. Like if your organization exists to save baby hippos, for instance, like, you know, how many more baby hippos would we save per week if we had this a week earlier? So you can actually denominate it in the thing that sort of drives the organization. Yeah, public sector can be a bit more challenging, but I've seen that as well. I've got one in here from, for my sins, I worked on the early stages of HS2 in the UK, High Speed 2. It's the lines that run up to Liverpool, Manchester. Well, I'm not sure where it's going to run now. They keep on chopping cities out of it. But like, it was actually pretty easy to get started there in terms of like, there's usually a business case somewhere in your organization that you can use as a basis for for getting the numbers that you need. And you can start at that big picture level, like this initiative is worth this much. If I divide that, the benefits per annum, into a per week figure, there's some magic to just changing it from being a year or a 3-year benefits horizon to being per week. It just flips a different switch in people's head. A year just feels like it's too big and unwieldy, and it's just too much to handle. Whereas if you denominate it in a much smaller time increment, you'll get a different response from people. So I mean, the hardest thing I think I'd say is sort of just getting started.
And so just for the people online, by the way, we've got about 20 people online. If you do have a question online, please just drop it into the chat. I am keeping an eye on that. But I don't see any questions there, so we'll grab one from Sarah.
Well, why are you making the UI change?
So the question was, how do you quantify something like a UI change?
Yeah. Why are you making the UI change? Save time. Oh, okay, that sounds interesting. Tell me more.
But you might not know.
No, not necessarily. But in order for you to kind of do it, I mean, is it worth nothing? Should we just not do it?
What about something like a spelling mistake where, it's a small change, it doesn't actually change anything.
Yeah.
Saving time, it's just about looking like you're professional.
Well, no, let's take that. Let's take a spelling change as an example. Like, if you've got a spelling error in your app, what does that communicate to your customer base? That you lack attention to detail? That you don't care about your product? I think there's a certain care factor here that you're actually communicating through your product. Like, I can't remember the guy's name, but some conference in Estonia, I think I went to, where one of the speakers was talking about how our products are basically a gesture to our potential customer base that generates a response. And I think if you don't take good care of how you're presenting that says something about how you value the product itself, and will have a knock-on effect to your revenue and retention. I'd like to think so, yeah. So it might be hard to quantify, but even something as silly and small as a spelling error, yeah, I think that's worth us fixing. Now, would I bother writing a frickin' ticket for that? No, I'd just be like, next time in that area, I'll fix it, or I'd go and do it myself. Like, I don't want to bother the team with it, But sorry, I shouldn't touch that, should I?
What's the cost of delay of triggering the chief product officer's OCD? So.
Yeah.
Right. Question from. Oh, actually, I'll go to Jonathan. I think.
I'll say my bias before I ask this.
Go for it.
One of the challenges I find when trying to use cost of delay is in a fast-moving landscape, there's a lot of recency bias when you try to get that initial.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah. What about the thing you said was $1 million last week? Well, this week, that's do you have any guidance on how you do enough? Right? It's not. I can't spend time to make sure I get the right answer, but then it's too late.
Yeah.
Which is why I personally do lean heavier on it's my last version of ice, where the confidence isn't just a gut feel, but it's actually
Sure.
and I think that is one version of prioritization where you've done enough to know that the data you're feeding into it.
Yeah.
But I haven't found the comfortable mix with cost of delay. So, you go around to your data sales, your CS, try to rock how much opportunities for it.
Yeah.
Over time, but I really struggle with the recency bias, especially. Do you have any advice if I were to try and take on?
Are you going to paraphrase that?
I'll try and paraphrase that. So I think what you're saying is that how do you, in the lack of good quality information, you're trying to quantify the cost of delay, but you tend to bias towards the last person who yabbered in your ear about it and took that value. Is that kind of?
I think it's the effort required to sift through that reason,
Right.
I'm just going to go, that hit a sales this week. What's the buy? Because that's always going to change.
So I think it's quantifying I guess the cost of getting to the cost of delay, about how much do you want to invest in getting to that point.
So I think firstly, I understand where you're coming from, right? Like, startup land is a bit different, and I don't think it's necessarily bad. Like, usually startup land, you are taking some massive risks in order to create something brand new, and it's a fight for survival. What I find interesting about startup land is that it's often a bit more baked into just how everyone operates, in terms of, like, people have a better sense of what a customer is worth. You're so desperate for new customers and growth. There's a lot more drive for that. So I'd say, it's almost like it's kind of spread through the fabric of most startups anyway, would be one point to make. Second point to make would be that startup land is also rife with HiPPO decision making. Like, holy shitballs. Like, the CEO founder will have a different idea from week to week, and that can be super disruptive for the team. So the recency bias thing can be a really bad thing, because it's basically you're just constantly, quote unquote, pivoting from feature to feature, trying to find the thing that is kind of like, so gonna help you survive, basically. And I think the more your burn rate gets to the end of your runway, that becomes even more present, I think. So I think startup land, you're often fighting HiPPOs, and you're fighting a HiPPO who tends to feel very passionate about the problem space, which can be a really good thing, but it can also be kind of dangerous. I guess what I would say is, though, again, I would use cost of delay in your world, not at the feature level necessarily. I'd use it more as a general guide for the decisions that we're going to be making. So what is the value of a customer to move on? What is the lifetime value of a customer to move on, as an example? If you don't know that, then you best find out, because that's what you're hunting for, is customer lifetime value for a new customer. You're creating new customers constantly. I don't know if you're still with me, or you just wear the shirt, or like. Well, I've just told the whole world. Yeah, I'd say. I mean, I happen to know Misha from his time at Curious. Before Curious went down the services route rather than the product route. You guys are the product arm of Curious. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think you can, like I'm saying, I think you can basically take it more of a lens across the whole. And there are some basic building blocks that you'll need for cost of delay, even if you want to do it at the feature level or the initiative level, that actually, if you understand the broader value of customers, I think we should all do that anyway. I mean, startups get a lot of things right? And, the survival mentality is a lot of what drives that. And if you don't get it right, then you die. So that's how the market works. Whereas for the rest of us, it's actually, we don't have that. And a lot of the value is actually a lot more hidden. The natural urgency isn't there. So in terms of changing the conversation, I'd say it's less powerful in startup land. But startup land is also a bit weird. Like, a whole bunch of things that just don't make sense when you're just fueled by VC money, when if you're not bootstrapped, if you're more VC fueled, shit that just doesn't make sense economically, because you're going for a monopoly. And monopoly economics are weird. So yeah, but for the rest of us, we're not like startups. So
we'll grab one more question from the room, and then I got one more question online, and then we'll have to call it because we're running short on time. So.
Yeah. We're back to the differential cost of delay thing. Yes, you kind of do, but you do it without doing the hard math. It's basically, if you've got a sense of what the cost of delay for all of the things, yeah, you're choosing not to do X, Y, Z in order to focus on A and then B. CD3 is really just a scheduling algorithm. There's no real magic to it. Yeah, and you can ignore it if you like. But if you've got a good reason for going in a different direction, then go for your life. There's no, this isn't Catholicism. You're not going to hell if you choose the wrong one.
The question for the people online is how do you work in opportunity cost? In case you're curious.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I jumped without that.
Appreciate the enthusiasm. Right. And last question from Aaron online is how do you go about quantifying the death by 1,000 cuts type of issues?
Example?
So lots of little things. So we've got lots of little things.
Little requests that are coming in.
But he's got only a few lines, so I'm interpreting. But
yeah, I would say
yes. Let's make an assumption and say yes.
Well, it really depends where that demand is coming from. I would say, like if you could try to get, if there's tons and tons of stuff coming at you, like you're just swamped by a whole a boatload of requests, then like I was mentioning earlier, like if you can try to get a sense of value before you actually put any effort into it from a squad perspective, that's super helpful. Like the people who are actually closer to the information, the people requesting it, usually have a better sense of the value of that problem and solving that problem. So I'd consider a little bit of a process change to kind of help weed out some of the good stuff within that.
Grouping or something like that. Yeah.
A bit of that. I mean, it tends to come in, there's a constant flow of it, so you don't just get a whole bunch of them. But yeah, I'd probably flip it back to them and just have them provide a bit more information before you then consider sifting through those. Would be one way of attacking it. The other thing to think about is, like I was mentioning earlier, like you can think of cost delay as more of like a backdrop for all of the things you do, rather than a, at the specific feature level. You can actually just kind of like, we have an understanding of what it would cost to get another customer. Like you can almost do it at the OKR level. If you're familiar with OKRs, you can basically look at, assuming we achieve that OKR, what is the value of that OKR? And you can actually do the cost of delay at that level. And then all of the death by 1,000 cuts is actually, accreting to get you closer to that particular thing. You're more kind of like saying, of all of these things here, which of these is going to move the needle the most on that particular OKR? Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. And then I think Aaron's not here to respond.
That's right.
We're lacking
Aaron
feedback.
will hit us up later, I'm sure. Right. Okay. We have to call it there because we're a little bit over time. So again, thank you so much, Josh.